Dreams on New York by Rachel Dax, performed by Fiona Knowles. Mary, aged 80, is sitting in a small garden outside a Pebble-Dash 1970s Scottish special house.
I fell in love for the first time at the age of 70. 70, you cry? Again, it does sound daft. A woman like me with 4 wains and 9 grand wains, never been in love, no even as a lassie. And then suddenly, bang, out of nowhere, running around like a teenager again. Dear God, the last 10 years have been amazing, I tell you. I didn't ken that happiness like this existed. I hear you, a day, asking, what, how, why? But first, I need to say that there are others, like me, who had dozens of fellas but never fell in love. Ah, you want to ken about the fellas? Well, I'm nae stranger to the cock, that's for sure. OK, let me go back to the beginning. I grew up in a town called Bo'ness, halfway between Glasgow and Edinburgh on the Firth of Forth. You ken, where the Forth rail bridge is. That bit. My dad worked down the pit, and my mam in our wee hoose scrubbing away all day. I was the youngest one of 9. Pape, no proddy. So about an average-sized family, given I was born in 1940. Well, I left school at 14. Back then you could if you were a lassie. And I wasn't much good at anyways. I kent what fate had in store for me. Leave school, work for a few years, get married, hae 8 or 10 wains, become a granny, and if lucky a great granny, and then die. Why did I need an education? My life was mapped out for me from the moment my ain granny cried down frae the bedroom to my father, "It's a lassie!" So at 14, I started a job in the shirt factory, where most of the young women of the town would work until they got married, and then maybe come back again as old girls if their husband had died and the wains was up. It didn't take long for me to ken I wasna suited to being in a factory full of women all day. "Are you winching yet, hen?" They'd ask me constantly. For those of you who didn't speak Scottish, that means, "Do you have a boyfriend?" All day, every day, women everywhere talking about what women back then talked about. Laddies, men, husbands, clothes, singers they wanted to kiss and film stars they wanted to marry. I hated it. I hated everything about it. And I made up my mind to go and work somewhere else with men. At least then I might have an answer to, "Are you winching, hen? Or have you got a steady fella yet, Mary?" So after 6 months of torture being surrounded by women, I got myself a job at the brewery and knew there were men everywhere. All ages, heights, looks, plenty of young ones near my age too. It took a certain type of man to work at the brewery rather than doing the pit. The miners, like my father, were gruff and grimy, and on the whole drank half their wages doing the pub every night. But funnily enough, the brewery men, although surrounded by beer all day, tended to drink less and generally were very clean. I mean, maybe they smelled a bit of hops, but their hands was scrubbed and They didn't hae black coal dust embedded in every crease and cranny. There was no hand sanitizer back then, just plenty of soap and water. Believe it or no, my generation didn't need coronavirus to remind us to wash our hands. But anyways, mostly they were men a girl would want to be around. I liked working in the brewery. My job was to wash the returned bottles. We kent about recycling back then too. Empty bottles were returned and you got a penny for your trouble. Oh, the pop was in bottles too. None of this plastic shite that's causing all the problems now. Sorry, I digress. I was young and pretty and surrounded by men. And of course I was asked out on dates. But I wasn't even 15 yet, so I would say, no, thank you. After all, I had strict Catholic parents. But soon there was an expectation. Older sisters first, then aunties, then eventually my mother. Every other week the same question, are you winching yet, hen? To which the answer was always, no. Gradually, sorry smiles turned to judgments, and I kent I had to do something to appease the nagging banshees that constantly bombarded me with the same question. So I decided to put a stop to it. I hadn't taken a fancy to anyone at the brewery, clean and pleasant though most of the young men were. But a laddie called Alfie had been sweeting me for a while, so I decided to sit next to him in the yard and eat my lunch piece with him. He asked me on a date, and I said I might do one day, but I wanted to ken him a bit better first. So we started sitting on the wall eating our pieces every day. A few weeks later he asked me out again, and I said no then as well. He looked sad, but said, well, can we meet behind the big vat tomorrow? 'Cause there's something I want to say to you in private. I kent this meant he wanted to kiss me, and I thought, well, okay, that'll be safer than going to a dance. You have to remember that back then, young lassies had to walk a tightrope between being available to men for winching, but no getting pregnant. If you weren't available, you were frigid. And if you were too available, you were a slut. You were maybe allowed a few boyfriends before settling down, but too many and you were a hussy, or much too fussy. It was a balancing act that so many lasses fell foul of. If you got pregnant before getting hitched, you were the scandal of the tune. Nobody, literally nobody, would speak to you. You couldn't go to the chapel. You couldn't get it seen to without burning in hell. It was hard on lassies back then. So many ended up in some kind of misery because they got it wrong. Sent away to a home for unmarried mothers, or married off quickly and sent to another town so nobody would ken the timeline. Poor cows, a lot of them. I didn't want to live in misery. But also, I didn't want my sisters, aunties, mothers, cousins and neighbours on at me all the time either. So I decided this was the way to manage it. I'd meet Alfie behind the large vat at lunchtime. Nobody'd be there as everybody had their lunch at 12. And I'd let him kiss me. And that's how it started. I let him kiss me. I felt nothing, but he seemed to like it and said, thank you. After that, I met him behind the vat every lunchtime, and we'd kiss and kiss some more. Each time he'd try and touch me a bit, but because I didn't fancy him, I didn't really like it, so I'd push him away. Kissing a man you're in love with is enough. He'd always try for more. I'd always refuse. Then one day he got cross and he said, I'm going to tell all the fellas here you're frigid. At which point I panicked, and for my own survival I put my hand in his trousers where he was already bulging, and I took out his cock and I rubbed it. until he spilled out all o'er the flare. Afterwards he smiled. His eyes was wide and he was shuddering. I said, I'm no frigid. I just canna hae a wean before a wedding. One thing can lead to another, so I'd rather just touch you and you dinna touch me. Have we a deal? And he grinned and he said, You mean you'd do that for me again, Mary? And I nodded and said, Aye, every day, as long as you didn't put your hands on me. And I kissed him and let him mop up his mess with his handkerchief. And that's how it went on. Nobody kent. There was no such thing as CCTV back then. And I guess they just assumed that because we were winching, we'd gone out for a walk. I wanked Alfie off behind the beer vats for over a year, without going on a single date. When the cry of, Are you winching yet, hen, came, I'd say, Aye, his name's Alfie, and we walk out together every lunchtime. And that seemed to keep everybody happy, until I was 16. But something funny used to happen once you turned 16. You couldn't refuse dates to young folks' dances or the pictures anymore. You couldn't because knew it was expected. Alfie began to nag, but I just didn't want to. And then, inevitably I suppose, he turned around to me one day and he said, Wee Ginger who works in the office says she'll go with me to the dance at the chapel hall on Saturday night. Do you mind? And I said, No, go ahead. It didn't take long before he was having his lunch piece with Ginger instead of me. But I really didn't mind. I was never going to fall in love with him, and he was never really in love with me. At least he never told me he was, however much I rubbed his cock. So I was happy he'd found somebody else. But of course knew I wasn't winching anymore, and I couldn't lie about Alfie because Bo'ness is a wee tune and it wouldn't take long to be found out. So I gave it a few weeks until the pressure about being single at nearly 17 years of age became too much. And then a laddie called John started asking me on dates. I agreed to sit with him at lunch so we could get to ken each other better. And then within a couple of weeks, when he started nagging to go to the chapel dance, I said, I will eventually, but let's have our first kiss somewhere nobody can see us. Then I took him behind the big vats, and before long it was just the same with him. After a few times kissing, he started to fumble and fiddle with my clays, and I, again, no remotely in love, and no wanting to be touched, reached down to his trousers and started rubbing his cock. And there we were. Are you winching again, hen? Asked Mammy. Aye, with John McManus, you ken, Maggie and Jimmy's son. We hae a walk every lunchtime. Ah, Mary, do you dinna think you should be doing a bit more than having a walk? Why do you not go to the dance down at the chapel like your sisters did? Aye, I will, ma'am, soon enough. She looked at me in a way that only a mother could look at a daughter and tell her everything she needed to ken without saying a word. A shudder of fear ran through me. Aye, ma'am, I was planning on going to the one at the end of the month. I went to the dance with John, and we had plenty of fun dancing. Then afterwards he walked me home via the woods. I rubbed him till I was done, and then he looked at me and he said, You're never going to let me touch you, are you, Mary? I said, No, I didn't want to wait until I'm wed. And then he said, But you didn't want to marry me, do you? And I looked down at my shoes and I said, You should marry a girl you're in love with, and who's in love with you, John McManus. And both of us ken that isn't me. We didn't meet again behind the vat. But after him came Mark, then Billy, then Russell, all at the brewery, all happy for me to wank them off at lunchtime and after the chapel dance on a Saturday night. until someone who wanted more than me came along. None of them ever seemed to hate me for no loving them. But like we all men, once something stops, you dinna stay pals. So that would be that. Nae more chat, nae more smiles, as if nothing had happened in the first place. I was 19 now, and my mammy sat me down and said, "Hen, you need to think about saying I do to one of these fellas you go dancing with, or folk are going to talk. You ain't 16 anymore. People will be thinking you're a slapper if you carry on like this with a new laddie every 6 months. And if they didn't think you're a slapper, they'll be thinking there's something wrong with you, that a fella can't stand you for long enough to pop the question." I nodded, kenning she was right. I had to get engaged next time or there'd be nothing but trouble down the road. It was around that time that a young woman my age called Lottie started working in the brewery. There weren't many women working there, and I was the only one in my section. She was employed as a bottle labeller and worked the other side of the flare for me. She was engaged to a fella called Max who worked in Falkirk as a fishmonger. She was a friendly lassie and always stopped for a chat. She had bright blue eyes and a mass of curly blonde hair that fell out her cloth hat. I was between fellas, so took to sit with her at lunchtime, and we talked about the pictures and music and where we would go if we had money to ever travel. I told her the only place I dreamed of going was New York. I'd seen it in 100 films and thought it must be the most exciting place on earth, and she agreed. She was easy company, and we laughed a lot. Then one morning she said, "Come to the disused lassies' changing room down by the gate at lunchtime. I've something I want to show you." There was part of me that kid this wasn't right, because alarm bells started ringing in my head as soon as she asked. But I agreed, not wanting to hurt her feelings if she had a secret to tell. So that lunchtime, as requested, I went to the old changing room, and when I got there she was waiting. The light didn't work, she told me, so it was dim from just one wee high window. She looked at me and said, "Mary," and then without further ado, she stepped forward and kissed me on the lips. I kent that what she wanted was immoral. I'd never heard the word lesbian back then, but nobody had to tell me it was wrong, because a few years before there'd been 2 fellas who'd been sent to the jail for being caught at it in the bushes down by the foreshore. It had been the scandal of the town for months. I pulled back and I looked at her, horrified, fear racing through me, making me almost dizzy. Then I slapped her hard across the face and ran out of there, no looking back. I went back to work that afternoon, but I couldn't concentrate, and I managed to smash at least 6 bottles, making the foreman furious. I refused to even look in the direction of Lottie's workstation, and I left on the first ring of the bell. On my way home, I walked straight to the engine factory 3 miles down the road and asked them if they'd any jobs going. The manager looked me up and down and said that the men would be delighted to have a bonny lassie like me serving them in the canteen, and asked if I could start on Monday, to which I said aye. The next morning, which was a Friday, I went into the brewery as usual, but I told my boss I wouldn't be back. I asked him not to say anything to the staff, as I didn't want any fuss. There was no sign of Lottie, and I didn't ask why she hadn't come to work that day, because I kent. She kent what she'd done was a sin, and if I told anybody, she'd be hounded out of both home and town. I was so appalled by what had happened, I vowed never to even think about it again, and I pushed it out of my mind. I had a new job, a new factory full of men. I was 19 years old and I needed to find a husband. You can't meet laddies at lunchtime if you work in a canteen. And at 19, nearly 20, you were expected to do more than just go dancing or to the pictures once a week. That was for young folk finding their feet. If you were female 20 and no at least engaged, there was nothing but comment. "Oh, you didn't want to be left on the shelf, hen. You're too fussy, lassie. If you keep turning these fellas down, you'll end up a spinster." And so it went. It was at the engine factory that I had my first bad encounter with a fella. I'd worked with men for over 4 years, and apart from the odd wolf whistle and a pinch in the ears, I'd never had any bother. But at the engine factory, the men were a bit rougher and a bit gobbier. If a lassie didn't hear a fella, or in some cases didn't hear a fella at that factory, then she could be in trouble. No such thing as women's lib back then. If a girl protested, she could be ruined with a few choice words. If a girl caved in, then she had to make sure she only caved in enough to get out the other side in one piece. As I said, I was planning to get engaged to the next nice laddie that asked anyways. But after a big bastard called Douglas followed me home from work and tried to drag me into the woods, I kent I couldn't wait. I got away from Douglas, but I never went home that way again. It was too easy for a man like that to pull a girl in on a dark winter's night, and nobody would believe a word she said, even if she came home covered in blood. There wasn't any Me Too back then either. If you were the woman, then you always lost. It was always your own fault, no matter what. Well, what was she doing near the woods at that time of night? Or, well, have you seen the length of her skirt? Or, well, she's had so many boyfriends he probably thought she wanted it. You didn't stand a chance. Anyways, Hamish, who also worked at the factory, had smiled at me a few times while I served him his grub. And I kent he was single because he was my cousin's best pal. A year older than me with a steady attitude, he seemed right enough. So when he waited at the factory gate one night and asked if he could walk me home, I let him. I was 20, he was 21. He'd been engaged to a lassie for a while, but her family had moved to Canada and she didn't want to be left behind and he didn't want to go, so they'd broke it off. It didn't take long for Hamish to be wanting more than just a kiss. And being older, finding excuses was more difficult. So in a couple of dates, I was satisfying him in the woods or in his dad's garden shed. Until one night, I saw a glint in his eye, and he pushed me hard against the wall and started pulling roughly at my clothes. I was terrified. I hadn't expected it, and I thought we had an arrangement, but no. He said he'd been patient enough. You ken, it's funny what you remember, and when and how you use it for your survival. I kent I wasn't going to get out of that shed unless he got more than a hand around his cock. And as he started being even more forceful, I remembered my sister telling me what a boyfriend who was a sailor had asked her to do to him with her mouth, because that's how they did it in France. But she'd refused. "Hamish," I hissed. "Wait, I have another way, one where I won't get knocked up." He still didn't stop, but I tugged at him and I said, "Let me show you first, and if you didn't like it, I promise we can try the other." The glint was still in his eye, but he hesitated, so I quickly went down on my knees and showed him exactly what I meant. Being a typical man of his time, he'd no idea such things existed, and within moments was ecstatic and loud enough to disturb the neighbours. Afterwards, he said, "I'm sorry, Mary, I kinda pushed you too far for the other, but if we do this every night from now on, I won't push again." I nodded and left, and then broke up with him the next day at the factory gates. Why am I telling you all this, you ask? do I need to tell you about who I learned to suck cock? Well, In all honesty, it meant that I had a happy marriage. After Hamish, I was on my last chance with my mother. She was furious that I'd let another decent man go and was getting a reputation for giving men the runaround. I kent more than ever that I had to marry my next fella. I was yet to feel a single loving emotion, even though I was nearly 21 and had rubbed mere cock in the last 6 years than most women have in a lifetime. When I met David at my second cousin's wedding and he asked me to dance, I kent he was somebody I should seriously consider. He was a painter on the Forth Rail Bridge, so he'd never be out of work. My parents kent and liked his family. He was 22, single and seemed good-natured, so we started winching. I told them flat out that I wouldn't let any man touch me until my wedding night, but there were things I could do for him that would make him happy. For the first few weeks, he was happy with my hand. And then, when he started getting restless, I gave him a mouth. And afterwards, he asked me to marry him. I said yes. But again, I told him I wouldn't do any more until our wedding night. He smiled and said that what we'd just done made him feel like we'd got married anyways, and that he'd be more than happy to wait. And he was. He was a nice man. Simple. He liked his job. He didn't drink heavily. He played amateur football on Saturdays and went fishing all day Sundays. I kent that even if it wasn't all hearts and flowers, I could tolerate him. So a year later, I stopped the nagging voices once and for all, and I married him. It's hard to believe now, after all this talk o' cock, that I was a virgin on my wedding night. But I assure you I was. Nobody'd even succeeded in taking my bra off. I didn't want him inside me, but I kent I'd no choice. So I lay back and I thought, oh, no, England? Why would I want to think of the land of the Sassenach? I lay back and I thought of Grangemouth Oil Refinery. Again. I but know the version of the oil refinery you see in the day, but how it looks at night, all lit up in the dark, like the twinkling New York City skyline. The only place I ever dreamed of going. It hurt, and I didn't enjoy it. But I kent that as long as I let him do it to me now and again, and the rest of the time I did the other two things I was so expert at by now, then he would be happy enough and I could stand it. Besides, we agreed to wait a bit before having weans because it would be nice to buy our own wee flat. And if we saved enough, we could move out of his parents' house where we were living until the council had a place for us. And so, for about a year and a half, that's what we did. I kept him happy, and I kept myself as happy as I could be, given I wasn't remotely in love and was going to be with him for the rest of my life. He didn't notice I wasn't in love. Like a lot of men of his generation, he didn't talk about emotions. He'd only told me he loved me a couple of times, and I'd replied, "Me too," rather than saying the words themselves. And he hadn't even clocked it. I made good food, I caused no trouble, and we got on well enough to have a wee laugh now and again. It was the least harassed I'd been by my family since the age of 16. "Nae mair, are you wenching hen? Nae mair, why aren't you married yet, lassie? You'll end up on the shelf." But then, as I said, about 18 months on, it started. "Are you not pregnant yet, Mary?" my father would ask. "Is everything going all right in the bedroom department?" my mum would whisper, disappointed to see my stomach still flat. And so it began, drip, 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 until it was a deluge of sisters, cousins and neighbours. Nobody ever asked me whether I actually wanted any weans. Nobody even thinks to ask a working class woman that question. And besides, even all the middle class women back then had wains, unless they were a dreaded spinster or a nun. If anybody, including David, had actually asked me what I wanted rather than assumed, I would have said no. But of course nobody did. And then one night David sat me down and said, I canna go on saving for a hoose before we have wains, Mary. The laddies at work keep taking the piss, saying I canna get it up or say I'm firing blanks. I remember looking at him, deciding whether to argue or no, tell him that I didn't really want wains. But I hadn't told him before we got married. I'd let him assume I did. So I couldn't turn around now and say that. We never argued, and I wanted it to stay that way. So I took a deep breath and I said, Aye, I'm getting it too. Maybe we could just hae the one and then keep saving like we're planned. It'll take a year or two longer, but it'll give us a council house if I'm pregnant. At least it'll be a place of rain. Of course, we never did have enough money to buy our own place. Because once we'd had one baby, within 18 months there was pressure to have another, and then another, and then more. It wasn't until I nearly died having my fourth that finally the nagging stopped, and my family, his family, and the rest of Bowness were satisfied enough to leave us alone. By that time I wasn't working any longer, and his wages just about covered the bills. Nae hame o' our ain. Another dream, like going to New York, that was never, ever going to happen. I ken. I've talked for ages, but I still haven't told you about how I finally, unexpectedly fell in love. And you've become impatient, so I'll cut to the chase. David and I were together until he died of a heart attack aged 52. By which time I was already a granny twice over. I was sad when he died. He'd been a good husband and we'd got on well. He'd never once hit me. He'd never been unkind. And he was out of the house enough not to annoy me to excess. After he went, I missed him. Here's the thing, and I must tell you this. Once you pass childbearing age, and especially once you're a granny, nobody has any sexual expectations of you as a woman ever again. Nobody. Nobody starts asking, are you inching hen? When you're in your 50s, they leave you alone. When you go back to work part-time, nobody pinches your ears or asks you to dances. You're invisible. You're nothing. You didn't exist in any real way at all. I loved my wains, in spite of never wanting any. I loved my grand wains just as much. I had pleased everybody eventually. Nobody had any great reason to be disappointed with me. Even my mother, in the end, thought I'd done a grand job of my life. So I drifted. Drifted in a way only a woman of that age could. Working part-time in the school canteen, babysitting the grandwains, watching TV when I was on my own. I had nae friends. I dinna ken whether you noticed that before, that I had nae friends. I'd avoided it. I'd stuck with my family, feeling it was safer. But then, and this is the bit you want to ken about, isn't it? Who is he? Who is the man I finally fell in love with age 70? Well, remember how I told you I'd always dreamed of going to New York? And back then it was a dream. Only rich people went to places like that. You have to remember I was in my 40s before working class people even started going to Torremolinos for their holidays. It's only nowadays that people like me can even think of going to America. Abroad wasn't something that we did. But anyways, my 3 daughters and my son, Kent had always wanted to go to New York. And like so many of their generation, they had a better education and better paying jobs than me or David could ever have hoped for. So they decided to treat me to a week in the city of my dreams. It was at the airport that I fell in love. I was excited. My guard was done. Finally, I would see the Big Apple for real, not just in a film. I couldn't wait. It was only my second time abroad. I'd been to Mallorca for my 60th with my eldest and her wains, that was it. Anyways, this is the bit you've been waiting for. I was in Glasgow Airport at the boarding gate looking around at the other travellers when I noticed a familiar face staring across at me. You have to realise that time ravages a woman's look, so it can take a wee while to work out who a person is. And then, when I did, I was filled with a tingling rush so powerful I felt all giddy. I didn't think to stop myself. I didn't hesitate for a moment. I simply got up out of my seat and walked over. There was nobody else those big blue eyes could belong to but her, Lottie. The lassie who'd kissed me over 50 years ago. The lassie I'd slapped and then run away frae. She was there with her twin sons. She stood up and we gave each other a hug and said all the usual things like, "Oh, I can't believe it's you," and "I haven't seen you since we were lasses." And then we pulled back, hands still holding our elbows, and gave each other a look. The kind of look that can pass between two women and say everything without anyone else seeing a thing. In that look, I kenned that I was the only girl she'd ever tried to kiss. That she, like me, had married a man she didn't love, had settled and conformed. And I also kenned that this time, if she kissed me, I wouldn't run. I wouldn't disappear. I wouldn't push the incident so far down inside me that it was like it never happened. I would kiss her back. By now the rush of love was so overwhelming that I thought I might give myself away. But I looked around and everybody was smiling. Two old women who were friends when they were but wee lasses bumping into each other at the airport. How lovely. And so I looked at her and I asked her the very thing I kenned she wanted to hear from my lips. Would you like to meet up and go somewhere together when we're both in New York? Her eyes lit up and her smile was broad. I'd love to. How about the Statue of Liberty, she replied. It couldn't have been anywhere else really, could it? Because we kent, not just me, we both kent already that we were finally free. Phone numbers were exchanged, plans arranged. I went back to my seat and tried not to look at her constantly. For the first time in my life, I was falling in love, really falling in love. When we got on the plane, she was at the other end from me, so we didn't really see each other during the flight. But I kent she'd be fidgeting in her seat, wanting to be with me as much as me with her. I couldn't manage normal conversation, so I pretended to be asleep. And I thought back to when I was young. I told you earlier, I never really had any friends. But I didn't tell you why. I'd never admitted to myself that the reason why I didn't fancy or love those men was because I liked women. That thought, not even the thought that might have come before it, was never allowed to form in my head, no. It was so pushed down, so repressed, that I never ever said to myself, I fancy that lassie, what's wrong with me? Or, I think I'm falling in love with that woman. No. Instead, I avoided women, somehow kenning they were dangerous for me. When I looked back, I realised it was why I left the shirt factory before I turned 15. I was like the other woman there. I couldn't participate in their conversations because I didn't feel the things they felt or think the things they thought about men. And I think, so long ago now it's hard to say for sure, that I must have started to notice them. Well, not all of them, but maybe one or two. The way they smiled or laughed perhaps excited me a wee bit too much. A glance too long as they leaned over in a certain way. I think maybe I started to feel desire, and so I made myself stop before I even acknowledged what it meant. Far safer to flee to the world of men. Surround myself with men, rub cock after cock, suck cock, and then eventually lie back and think of Grangemouth. Nobody could ever doubt I liked a good man. I had more boyfriends than any of my sister's cousins or neighbours' daughters. Nobody could suspect for a moment that I didn't love or fancy a single one of them, except perhaps my mother. Remember the look I told you about? It was that look when I kent that she kent there was something wrong with me, even if she didn't hear a name for it. She kent there was something and that I needed to conform, and she wouldn't be happy until I conformed, so I did. I surrounded myself with family, only went out with family, and remained a distantly polite neighbour, all without giving the reason why a name. In later years, as these things began being talked about and even shown on TV, I always found a way to avoid the conversation, turning over the drama where the women were falling in love before they kissed. Always stopped it, halted it, denied myself it. I couldn't, wouldn't, shouldn't. But then, there on the aeroplane, I let myself use the word. The L word. Lesbian. I am a lesbian. I found myself saying in my head, I am a lesbian, and I am going to kiss Lottie and make love with her in New York. I am a lesbian, and I'm going to let myself fall head over heels in love. I am a lesbian, and I have always been a lesbian, and no amount of suck cock can change it. On our third day there, we met at the ferry terminal and went to the Statue of Liberty as planned. We sat close, with our backs of our hands touching, fidgeting in our seats, chattering away about our lives, but wanting to do nothing but caress and kiss. When we got to the Statue of Liberty, tears began rolling down my cheeks because I really felt I was being liberated. Somehow we managed to climb to the very top despite our arthritic knees. And when we stood looking out at the great lady at the spectacular view, I turned to Lottie and kissed her on the cheek and whispered, "Is it safe to go to your hotel room?" I was sharing a room with my youngest daughter, so there was no chance of anything happening there. "Aye," she replied. "Let's get the next boat back." We made love that afternoon like two teenagers. The two teenagers we were when we met. I didn't need to lie back and think of Grangemouth Oil Refinery at night. I was in the real New York, feeling real love and real desire. I was in the land of the free and the city where dreams are made. I loved the feel of her touch. I didn't need to service her to avoid being groped by an undesired hand. I let her explore every inch of me and revelled in every moment. I had my first ever orgasm, and then my second, and then several more before I left, and so did she. That lassie who'd been brave enough to kiss me at the brewery back in 1961 had lived a life 12 miles up the road that was practically the same as mine. She'd married Max a few months after I'd run off. She had 5 weans. Nobody'd ever kent. she'd made herself forget. But then there we were. And suddenly nae time had passed at all, and we were as we should have been, and as we would be from now on, until one of us died. And we were. We never had a day when we didn't see each other after that. For the first year we lived between our two houses, and then eventually we said fuck it, and told our families, and I moved into her place. Our weans were all shocked, but of course it was the 21st century by now, and gay people were getting married every day of the week. People were going on marches, and with their straight pals too, so nobody really objected or played a face. I can see you welling up now, because you've realised Lottie has died. Don't cry, please. This is a happy ending. Lottie and I made love every day for nearly 10 years. We were deliriously happy and laughed and giggled and played like the wee lassies we were when we met. Of course, I'm broken-hearted that she's gone. But I ken how lucky I was to have her, to have had any happiness at all. If I hadn't gone to New York and gone on that particular day, I would never have met her again. I would have spent the last 10 years drifting into old age, still living like an empty shell. But instead, I had the richest, most beautiful time of my life. I loved and I lived. How many people, hand on heart, can say they had 10 years of absolute bliss with another human being? So dinna be sad. Think of all the women like me who never had this, who lived and died, never having a chance to be themselves. Think of all the women living in foreign countries where it's as impossible for them now as it was for me back then. Think about your granny. Do you ken for sure she was happy? Dinna be sad. I had a happy ending.
Dreams on New York from the In Isolation Monologue Suite was written, directed and produced by Rachel Dax. Performed by Fiona Knowles, with Soundscape by David Shell and original music by Joe Gendel.